a soft, slow unravelling of time and memory and meaning. Tonight, we're descending into the dark. Not just any dark, but the architectural, mathematical, holy dark that lies beneath 70 million tons of stone. A place not built for the living. A place not meant to be found. And yet, we found it anyway. Because this episode isn't about pyramids, not really. It's about why anyone would build a pyramid in the first place. It's about death, not as an ending, but as a technology, a doorway, a throne. See, the ancient Egyptians didn't fear death. They feared disorder, chaos, an interruption in the flow. What they feared was a universe where nothing connected anymore. And so they built an entire civilization around the idea that death had to be managed, choreographed, beautified. Because if you did it right, death wasn't just survivable, it was divine. And at the centre of this belief stood a god who died, Osiris, brother of chaos, father of resurrection, king of the underworld. But to understand what the pharaohs knew, we have to understand the story they told again and again for over 3,000 years. The myth of Osiris wasn't just bedtime poetry for children, it was a constitutional truth, a metaphysical manual, a psychological infrastructure so foundational that every king, every peasant, every pyramid scheme in the Nile Valley was built in its shadow. So let's start there slowly. Let's unroll this linen-wrapped myth. Osiris, god of fertility, vegetation, renewal, was beloved by the people. He brought laws, crops, order. He tamed the wild Nile, but his brother, Set, was chaos incarnate. Jealous, violent, primal, and in the oldest version of the myth, Set doesn't just kill Osiris, he tears him apart, literally. According to the story, Set lured Osiris into a coffin made to fit his body exactly, then sealed it shut, threw it into the Nile, and watched it drift away. But that wasn't enough. Set hunted the body, dismembered it, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. This is where the magic begins, because Isis, wife and sister of Osiris, searches for the parts. She finds them. All except one, his phallus swallowed by a fish. She reassembles him, wraps him in linen, breathes life into a corpse, and conceives a son Horus who will avenge his father. Osiris, meanwhile, does not return to the land of the living. He becomes something stranger, something sacred. He becomes the ruler of the underworld. Not a ghost, not a spirit, a judge, a god. So what did the Egyptians learn from this myth? Not that death was scary, but that death was a process, a ritual that required recovery, assembly, justice, continuity. Every Egyptian tomb, every funerary spell, every painted sarcophagus is a reference to this myth. Every pharaoh is Osiris waiting to be remembered, reassembled, reborn. This wasn't a metaphor, it was the national religion. Death wasn't the end of your life, it was the continuation of your status. And for the pharaoh, the one who embodied Horus in life, the transition to Osiris in death wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. In fact, the entire purpose of his reign was to earn that transformation. Because once dead, the pharaoh wasn't just remembered, he was required. He became part of the cosmic machinery. His soul, or bi'ar, would journey through the duat, the underworld, and face trials, demons, riddles, and scales. The most famous of which, of course, was the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Ma'at, the heart of the deceased would be placed on one side of the scale, on the other side a feather. If your heart was heavy with lies, cruelty, arrogance, it would tip the scale, and you would be devoured by a creature named Ammit, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile. She didn't punish, she erased. But if your heart was balanced light, honest, aligned with Momat, you move forward. Into the field of reeds, a lush, eternal version of Egypt where you could farm, drink, love, and exist forever in perfected form. But to get there, you had to be ready. And readiness wasn't about belief, it was about preparation. The Egyptians prepared for death the way you'd prepare for an international trip. Passports, documents, a change of clothes. They packed papyrus scrolls full of spells, ritual objects, servants, amulets, maps, and most importantly, they built homes for the soul. This is where the tomb becomes more than a burial site. It's a survival kit, a resurrection chamber. The walls of the tomb weren't decorations, they were instructions. Images of the gods, journeys through night, Solar boats, sacred cows, spells to open mouths, to loosen limbs, to breathe again. Everything had a purpose, even the body itself, which had to be mummified, not just preserved, but transformed, wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, perfumed, blessed, because the soul needed to recognize its vessel. So imagine now what this meant for a society. When every death was a cosmic appointment, when every life was measured by how well you rehearsed your death. The pyramids weren't built by people obsessed with death. They were built by people obsessed with returning as gods, as energies, as rightful members of the cosmic court. This is the truth the pharaohs knew, that ruling the living was temporary, but ruling the dead that was forever, and so they spent their lives preparing. Because eternity in ancient Egypt wasn't about faith, it was about protocol, and the king who failed to prepare simply ceased to exist. You and I, we don't build pyramids, we don't embalm our friends, we don't speak of the soul's journey with the same architectural conviction, but maybe we should pay attention, because while we scroll through feeds and fear aging like a glitch, the Egyptians were already designing immortality by hand, by stone, by spell. So tonight, as we follow this story deeper into the sand and shadow, remember this: they weren't afraid of dying, they were afraid of being forgotten. So they wrote their names in gold, built staircases for the soul, and shaped a world where to die was not to vanish, but to begin. Close your eyes, if you like. Let the echoes of old gods swirl quietly around your thoughts. We've only just entered the tomb, and there is so much more waiting inside. They called him Nesubit, he of the sedge and bee, the living get of flesh and bone of the sky. To us he's just a king, a man in a museum, a dried face behind a fingerprint-smudged glass. But to the people of Egypt, the pharaoh was something else entirely, something that lived in both worlds at once, the morning sun and the shadow it cast. In life he was Horus the falcon-eyed protector, divine son of Isis and Osiris, the ruler who tamed the world with clarity and cosmic law. In death he became Osiris the resurrected judge, the dead who would not decay. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a job description. To be pharaoh was not to rule by will but by design. You were a link, a bridge, a human hinge holding heaven and earth together. The job came with a crown, but it also came with terrifying responsibilities, because the world in ancient Egypt was always on the verge of collapse. The Nile could flood too much or not at all. Crops could fail, enemies could rise, and beneath it all there was Isfet. Isfet, the word for chaos, for the unformed, for the broken pattern. It wasn't evil exactly, it was unravelling, and the only thing that kept it at bay was Ma'at. Ma'at wasn't just truth, it was symmetry, balance, cosmic choreography, the way stars moved, the way a feather fell. And the pharaoh? He was the earthly embodiment of Ma'at. Not a king, not a warlord, a principle. His breath had to match the rhythm of the Nile. His heartbeat had to mirror the sun's return. His presence alone was said to stabilize the cosmos, which is why every ceremony, every law, every punishment had to flow through him. Because if he failed, the universe cracked. The crown itself told the story. The white head jet of Upper Egypt, the red deshret of Lower Egypt. Worn together, they formed the Shent, the double crown, symbolizing unity of the land and unity of the worlds. Even the pharaoh's regalia was symbolic technology. The crook and flail weren't props, they represented shepherd and scourge, protector and punisher. The uraeus, the cobra on his forehead, wasn't jewellery. It was Wadjet, the goddess of divine authority, ready to strike. He wore Ma'at in metal and stone, and was expected to live it. Every decree was a spell. Every war was a cleansing. Every birth, a ritual. He wasn't allowed to sweat in public. His image had to be perfect, his form symmetrical, because his body was no longer his own, it belonged to the gods. Even his name was divided. The throne name, the birth name, the Horus name, the golden Horus name, the two ladies' name. 5 identities layered like the architecture of the afterlife. And it wasn't just pageantry. If a pharaoh misspoke, it wasn't a political gaffe. It was an ontological error. The stakes were metaphysical. He wasn't immortal, but he couldn't be merely mortal either. He was a man standing between 2 mirrors, one reflecting the gods, one reflecting the people. So when the pharaoh died, It wasn't just a ruler who passed. It was a cosmic emergency. Everything had to be corrected, balanced, rewritten. The rituals were exhaustive. The tomb, divine infrastructure. The funerary rites, corrective software. Because a dead Pharaoh wasn't dead. He had moved roles from Horus to Osiris. And the moment he became Osiris, the cycle restarted. His son, now Horus, became king, and the universe continued its loop. This was the most dangerous moment in Egyptian existence, the handoff. If the king failed to become Osiris, if the son failed to become Horus, the world ended. So now you understand the pyramid wasn't a monument, it was a throne. And the pharaoh wasn't a man, he was a principle dressed in flesh. A living god holding the sky open with both hands, and he couldn't drop it, not even for a moment. So the next time you look at a statue of a pharaoh frozen, symmetrical, eternal, know this, it wasn't about ego, it was about responsibility, and the greatest burden in the ancient world was to be the hinge that held the heavens in place. What kind of walls can contain a god? What kind of stone is holy enough to cradle a soul? Because the Egyptians didn't just bury their kings, they installed them, like sacred engines humming beneath the sand. Their tombs weren't mausoleums, they were continuity systems, time-proof scaffolding, for a belief so enormous it had to be carved in bulk. That's what the pyramids were, not monuments to ego, but metaphysical infrastructure. And once you know that, you can stop asking how they built them and start asking why they thought they had to. Because here's the quiet truth. The Egyptians weren't just preparing their pharaoh for the afterlife, they were protecting us from what would happen if he didn't make it. Every brick was a prayer, every measurement a spell. The pyramid was a machine built with precision so crisp it could catch light, anchor the sun and echo eternity. To us, it's geometry. To them, it was survival. Without it, the cycle broke. The Nile wouldn't rise, the gods wouldn't wake, the dead wouldn't walk. Mahat would flicker, and Isfet would slip through the cracks. And that wasn't superstition, it was infrastructure policy. Because when you believed the king was the keystone of the cosmos, you couldn't afford a loose fit. So they aligned the Great Pyramid with true north to within 3/60ths of a degree. They engineered descending passages that pointed to stars. They built the internal chambers in harmonic proportions, not for tourists, not for show, but because the soul, like the stars, had to travel on track. This was the logic of death in Egypt. The soul needs stairs, the universe needs symmetry, and if the soul of the king fell out of orbit, so did you. It's hard for us to fathom a government with that kind of scope, but imagine a society where theology, physics, engineering and architecture all answered to the same boss, the pharaoh, the planner of tombs, the bearer of balance, and the one who'd have to pass his cosmic inspection post-mortem, which meant there was no such thing as after, only the next phase of duty. And the king's duties didn't end when he died. They multiplied. He still had to travel through the duat, still had to recite the right passwords, still had to fend off demons and declare his innocence to 42 divine judges, still had to recognize the gods, name the doors, walk the solar bark, and ascend to the stars. And if he didn't just fail himself, he failed everyone. So the people built, they painted, they prayed, they preserved his body with natron salts, took out his organs, dried his tongue, stuffed him with linen, and placed a golden mask over his face not to honor him, but to remind him of who he was and who he still had to be. This was not nostalgia, it was instruction. Because in a system where the king is divine and divinity requires participation, death is never passive. Death is administrative. And somewhere in all this cosmic bureaucracy, the pharaoh this man once called Flesh of Ra became more than a symbol. He became an equation, one you had to balance for the world to go on spinning. That's why the tomb wasn't just sealed, it was blessed, cursed, chanted over. Not to keep people out, but to keep failure out. Because if the wrong words were spoken in the duat, if the wrong gate was opened, if the wrong spirit got in, the world could come undone. So yes, we laugh at the curses now, we roll our eyes at the cat mummies and the strange spells, but maybe we shouldn't. Because even if the gods weren't real in the way we think of real, the order they represented was, the system worked for thousands of years, and maybe that's the most unsettling part. that death didn't defeat Egypt, we did, but we'll get to that. For now, just sit with this: a civilization that built eternity into stone, that made death its greatest ministry, and that gave us the first and possibly last blueprint for divine continuity. Not a heaven in the clouds, not a hell in the ground, but a chamber, a spell, a name etched deep enough into limestone that it might outlive the wind, because in the end the pharaohs didn't try to escape to death. They tried to organise it, and somehow they almost did. Another slow step into the dark, another story carved in stone, another page of eternity, carefully folded under sand. Because if you've made it this far, still with me, still listening, in the hush of wherever you are, then maybe you're ready for what comes next. We've talked about the pharaoh as a living god, the hinge between heaven and earth, the one whose death wasn't a disappearance but a job transfer. So now comes the real question. How do you build a container for divinity? How do you design a structure that holds a soul? Because that's what the Egyptians set out to do, not to build graves, but to engineer resurrection, not to remember the king, but to relaunch him. What you're about to walk through isn't just architecture, it's theology in limestone. And it begins not with pyramids, but with something much simpler, a mastaba. Picture it, a flat-roofed rectangular structure built from mud brick, low-sloped sides. The word means bench in Arabic, and that's more or less what it looked like, a big, solid, rectangular bench squatting over the desert. But beneath it, that's where the magic was. Burial shafts, chambers, secret compartments, storage for food, pottery, jewellery, linens, all the things the dead might need, because death, remember, was a continuation. And the mastaba was the first version of a very serious blueprint. Over time, these grew more complex, more lavish, and then came a moment of genius. Around 26 and 70 BCE, a brilliant architect named Imhotep had an idea. Why not stack the mastabas, literally, one on top of the other, 6 rectangular layers, each smaller than the last, rising toward the sky like a giant staircase. And just like that, the step pyramid was born. The first one built for King Djoser at Saqqara still stands, over 4,600 years later. Its limestone core cracked and weathered, but its presence still absolute. A staircase for the soul, a cosmic ladder. But the Egyptians weren't done yet, because once you start climbing, once you understand that death is an ascent, you can't help but ask, how high can we go? So the step pyramid evolved, smoothed out, angled, sharpened. Enter the true pyramid. We're now in the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, 26th century BC, and we need to talk about Sneferu. Sneferu was the Steve Jobs of pharaohs, restless, ambitious, constantly iterating. He built at least 3 major pyramids, maybe more. One collapsed, one bent, one finally stood perfect. That last one, the Red Pyramid, is often overshadowed by what came next. But it matters, because it worked. It proved the idea. And his son Khufu took it further. Enter the Great Pyramid of Giza, 47 metres tall, originally covered in gleaming white Tura limestone. Each block weighing several tons, aligned to true north with astounding precision. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a declaration that the king had mastered not only earth but the heavens, that his soul had a runway, because yes, the pyramid had chambers, the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, the grand gallery, air shafts. But none of it was random. Those shafts, they weren't for breathing, they were aimed at stars. Specifically the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, the ones that circle the sky forever, never dipping below the horizon, known today as the imperishables. That's where the soul of the pharaoh was supposed to go, not to heaven, not to hell, but to the stars that never die. That's how serious this was. You didn't just bury a king, you calibrated him. You placed him into an alignment so precise, so symbolic, that the structure itself became a machine, not mechanical, but cosmic, a resurrection device, and everything had meaning. The triangle wasn't just a shape, it was a solar symbol. The base represented the earth, the point, the heavens, the slope, the passage of the sun. Each side of the pyramid faced a cardinal direction. Each angle mattered. Even the proportions echoed sacred ratios. This wasn't superstition. It was belief made structural. So let's step inside. It's not grand, not flashy. The passages are low, claustrophobic, but the geometry is deliberate. The ascending corridor leads to the grand gallery, which in turn leads to the king's chamber where the sarcophagus rests. No hieroglyphs, no paintings, just stone. Because this wasn't a place for the living, it was a vessel. And once the king was placed inside, sealed, spelled, ritually activated, the structure was complete. You could walk away and let the machine do its work, but it didn't last. The era of giant pyramids faded, too visible, too tempting for thieves. And so the Egyptians adapted. They went underground. By the time we reach the New Kingdom, burial has changed. The pyramids are no more. The Valley of the Kings has risen. Now, instead of reaching for the stars, the tombs dig into the rock. Winding corridors, hidden chambers, painted walls, and here the architecture becomes even more symbolic. The journey isn't vertical, it's horizontal. A path, a story. The soul travels through the underworld, past demons, through gates, past gods with crocodile heads and serpents of fire, each room a chapter, each wall a spell, each turning a psychological trial. The tomb of Thutmose III is carved high into the cliff wall, accessible only by ladder. His burial chamber is oval, the ceiling covered in stars. Ramesses VI, his tomb features the Book of the Gates, a full illustrated guide to what the soul would face. Tutankhamun, a relatively modest tomb but packed with gear, chariots, thrones, amulets, beds, food, weapons, because the afterlife required equipment. And the tomb wasn't a grave, it was a launch pad, but no matter the form, pyramid or passage, chamber or shaft, the goal remained the same: to make sure the king continued, to ensure he didn't fall into nothingness, to place him within the pattern. And that's the thing. The Egyptians didn't just fear death, they feared chaos, and chaos meant forgetting the path. So they engraved it, on walls, in books, on coffins, everywhere. The journey had to be remembered, because the soul, like the sun, had to rise again. So what do we do with this now? We, who bury our dead in rectangles and forget the rituals, we who tuck death into hospitals and closets and white plastic urns, maybe nothing. Maybe this is just a story, but maybe we've lost something. Not in the superstition, not in the magic spells, but in the intent. The deliberate beauty of building something not for yourself, but for what you'll become. To spend a lifetime preparing your soul to travel, to carve a path so you don't get lost. To believe, even just symbolically, that memory is navigation. The pyramids weren't built because they were powerful. They were powerful because they were built. So maybe tonight, as the shadows stretch and your mind slows, you can let that sink in. You don't need a tomb, you don't need a sarcophagus, but you might need a map. And the Egyptians left us a few. Carved in stars, etched in stone, buried but not gone. Still waiting just beneath the sand. Let's go deeper now, down past the limestone walls and star-painted ceilings, past the rubble and cracked stone and filtered flashlight beams, down into the ritual core of it all. Because the Pharaoh's tomb was never complete without the body, and the body was never just a body, it was the vessel, the template, the anchor point, the spell. What the modern world calls mummification, the Egyptians called 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐒 magic. Not illusion, not trickery, not some primitive embalming mistake from the before science era. This wasn't about preservation for its own sake. This was transformation, preparation, cosmology made tactile. The soul had many parts. The 𝐓𝐾𝐒, your life force, your double, your energetic twin. The 𝐵, your personality, your soul's mobility. The part of you that could fly. The 𝐴, your transfigured spirit, luminous and eternal. And then there were the 𝑅EN, your name, the 𝐻𝐸t, your shadow, and the physical body itself, 𝐶at. All of them had to work together. All of them had to be preserved, or nothing would function. The afterlife wasn't automatic, it was a high-stakes orchestration, and it began with death, or more accurately with removal. The process could take 70 days. It began with a team of ritual embalmers overseen by priests wearing jackal masks, symbols of Anubis, Lord of the Dead. The first act? A cut, sharp and symbolic. A blade drawn down the left side of the torso. The belly opened. The body reversed. Out came the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver. Each organ washed, dried with natron salt and placed in its own canopic jar. The jars were not labelled randomly. Each was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐌𝐏𝐒 guarded the liver. Hapi the lungs. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 the stomach. 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐒𝐓𝐀 the intestines. Each jar sealed with a lid shaped like the head of its guardian human. Baboon, jackal, falcon. This wasn't anatomy, it was theology. Because each organ corresponded not just to bodily function, but to cosmic meaning. The heart notably was left inside. At least that was the goal. The heart was sacred. It would be needed for the weighing ceremony, the moment of judgment. Except here's the twist. In many mummies we've examined, the heart is missing. Why? Scholars still debate. Was it removed by mistake, or was it symbolically replaced with a scarab, a stand-in, a safeguard? What's clear is that the heart mattered, because without it, there was no way to prove innocence. And innocence in Egypt wasn't about moral purity in the Christian sense. It was about alignment. You had to be in ma'at. Balanced, truthful, harmonized with the cosmic order, which is why the rituals were so precise, every step, every wrapping, every prayer. After the organs were removed, the body was packed and covered in naturally occurring salt-absorbing moisture, warding off decay. It would sit like this for 40 days. Then came the oils, the resins, the linen, layer after layer after layer, each wrap infused with incense, myrrh, frankincense, antiseptic, yes, but also symbolic. Because this wasn't preservation, it was resurrection logistics. The mouth had to be opened, the eyes painted, the nails covered in gold, the limbs straightened, the skin darkened with resin the colour of Osiris, god of the dead. Gold wasn't for display, it was for divinity. The gods were said to have flesh of gold, bones of silver, hair of lapis. To cover the king in gold was to prepare him to become a god, so the face was masked, the nails gilded, the amulets placed, dozens of them, the eye of Horus for protection, the scarab for rebirth, the jed pillar for stability, the ankh for eternal life, each one with its own soul, its own placement, its own role in the afterlife circuit board. And around it all is text, spells, chants, instructions, maps. We call it the Book of the Dead, but that's a misnomer. The original name was the Book of Going Forth by Day. It wasn't a static text, it wasn't even a single book, it was a collection, a script, a flexible modular afterlife toolkit tailored to the individual. Some copies had 30 spells, some had multi, some were on papyrus, others painted on walls, coffins, linens, and what they contained wasn't abstract, it was practical. Say this spell to pass the serpent, say this name to open the gate, speak these words to transform into a swallow, a lotus, a divine falcon. Spell 125 was the heart of it, the negative confession. The soul stands before 42 judges, each representing a sin, waiting to hear you deny it. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused pain. I have not polluted the water. I have not raised my voice. It was less about perfection and more about calibration. To say the words was to align with ma'at, and ma'at was the prerequisite for entry. If you passed, your heart was returned. Your soul was freed. If not, Amit devoured you. No trial, no appeals, just undoing. And so every element of the mummification process was aimed at avoiding that. You didn't just preserve the body, you fortified it, you ritualized it. Because the soul couldn't travel alone, it needed guides, maps, symbols, backup. So even the coffin mattered, often nested one inside another, painted with spells, covered in gods. Eyes were drawn so the dead could see, feet pointed west toward the realm of the setting sun. And beneath the wrappings, small papyrus slips were inserted. Tiny texts, micro-guides. Imagine that, a cheat sheet for eternity. Even the hands were sometimes crossed in ritual poses, fingers wrapped separately, mouths ritually opened with a special tool, a kind of chisel, used by priests in a symbolic act of giving speech. So the soul could speak again, so it could answer the judges, so it could name the gods. All of this was done not to venerate the past, but to program the future. Because in Egypt, the afterlife wasn't vague, it was engineered. It had gates, guardians, passwords, transit times. You weren't going to heaven. You were going through the duat. A landscape of fire lakes and serpent rivers, solar boats and inverted mountains, and every step had to be performed in sequence, which meant the body had to be perfect. Even damaged corpses were ritually repaired. Missing limbs replaced with wooden replicas, broken skulls filled with resin, decay reversed by faith, because the body had to be recognized by the soul. If the bar couldn't find the cat you were lost, that's what all this was for, to prevent spiritual amnesia, to make sure your essence knew where to return. And for the pharaoh this mattered even more, because he wasn't just one soul, he was the axis. If his resurrection failed, the state itself risked collapse, so his mummification was more elaborate. Longer rituals, more priests, more amulets, more gold. His Book of the Dead wasn't just a scroll, it was an engine. He needed to travel by solar boat, to merge with Ra, to battle Apophis, to rise again not as a memory, but as function. And in that rising the world stabilized, the Nile rose, the crops returned, and Maat was restored. So no, this wasn't primitive science. This was spiritual engineering. Body as blueprint, soul as signal, tomb as circuit. And still it didn't always work. Bodies decayed, tombs were looted, spells forgotten, names lost. But for thousands of years they tried. They cut and packed and wrapped and wrote, because they believed that the divine was not beyond reach. It just had to be built, one layer of linen at a time. So tonight, maybe take that with you, that death doesn't have to be chaos, that memory can be engineered, that gold can be holy, and that perhaps, somewhere in the sand, a king is still waiting to rise wrapped in geometry, inked in incantation, ready to speak his name into the stars. It's morning in ancient Thebes. The air is still cool, the sun not yet a glare but a promise, a slow spill of gold across the limestone courtyards and reed-lined pools. Somewhere a conch is blown, somewhere else a priest begins to chant. But here in the inner chambers of the palace the pharaoh stirs, not to luxury, not to pleasure, but to procedure, because to rule Egypt was not to lounge in velvet or sip wine from ivory cups, not primarily. It was to perform, to preserve, to participate in the liturgy of time itself. And every single day began the same way, with purification, water drawn from sacred wells or poured by hand into alabaster basins. The pharaoh did not bathe like a man. He was washed like a statue, like a relic, by temple attendants trained in rites passed down for centuries. His body shaved smooth, no hair permitted to interfere with divinity. His skin rubbed with unguents, frankincense, myrrh, lotus oil, not for scent, but for symbolism. Purity had fragrance, identity had texture. Each oil corresponded to a god, each layer a declaration of alignment. His eyes painted not for beauty, but for protection. Kohl around the lids to ward off disease, green malachite inlaid beneath to channel the healing power of Hathor. His nails trimmed, his hands anointed, his feet brushed with perfumes, not vanity, not indulgence, or calibration, because the pharaoh's body was not personal, it was national property. His breath anchored the seasons. His heartbeat stood between order and collapse. So he was dressed not by whim, but by rite. The linen fine, bleached, sacred, woven in temples, measured in cubits, cut in silence, layered in harmony with ancient design. Every fold had a precedent, every sash had a rule. Then came the crown, not a simple diadem, but a theological apparatus. Depending on the occasion, he might wear the white crown of Upper Egypt or the red crown of Lower Egypt. Sometimes the double crown, merging both. Sometimes the Nemes headcloth, sometimes the Kepresh, the blue war crown. Each choice was deliberate. Each one told the world where he stood, what he was invoking, which gods walked with him that day. On this morning it's the red and white, the Shent unity, wholeness, the cosmos sealed in one man. And then he walked. To us, walking is movement. To the pharaoh it was maintenance. He stepped from the palace to the temple, and in doing so he reenacted creation. Because in Egyptian cosmology, the universe began with emergence, with a god stepping onto the primordial mound, with order rising out of water. And each morning the king did the same. He moved through gates, through gardens, through causeways lined with lion statues or sphinxes, each step an echo. When he entered the temple, he did not sit. He worked. Because the temple wasn't a house of worship like we imagine. It was a machine, a cosmic battery, a schedule of rites and recitations designed to keep the gods awake, to keep Ma'at flowing, to keep the sun from crashing into the underworld. The gods did not feed themselves. They had to be fed. The pharaoh, or more precisely the priests acting on his behalf, bathed the statues of the gods. They burned incense, offered bread, poured milk, sang hymns, dabbed oils onto carved stone, dressed the deity in linen. Why? Because gods needed attention, not worship, recognition. Without it, they could dissolve into chaos. And the pharaoh, as the high priest of every temple in Egypt, was responsible for all of it. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Actually, even if he wasn't physically present, the rituals were done in his name, because only his name had the authority to complete them. So every act, lighting a lamp, opening a door, sprinkling water, was a rite. Each had its own incantation. Each had its own gesture. Every day, every week, every season. Hundreds of rituals, each more ancient than the last, stacked like gears in a divine clockwork. And failure wasn't just bad form. It was cosmic instability. To miss a rite was to risk famine. To mispronounce a spell was to invite plague. To wear the wrong sash was to misalign the world. So the king's routine was not flexible. It was essential. This is the part modern minds struggle with. We think of power as liberty. But for the pharaoh, power was constraint. He couldn't sneeze in public. He couldn't bleed. He couldn't show weakness or doubt or hunger, because to do so was to fracture the illusion. And the illusion was the architecture. If the people lost faith in him, the cosmic pattern frayed. So he performed, and not just for others. He performed for the sky. He turned his face to the sun at noon. He offered incense to Ra. He lifted his hands in the gestures of rebirth, renewal, replication. He had to be seen doing it, not for cameras, but for continuity. Because if the kings didn't do the rites, who would? Who would remind the Nile to rise? Who would speak the names of the gods? This wasn't superstition. It was maintenance, a sacred, daily maintenance of the engine that held reality together. And still, there was more. After the rites came the governance, meetings with viziers, judgment of disputes, decrees issued in the name of Ma'at. The court wasn't politics, it was ritual. Even justice had to be performed in accordance with sacred pattern. The weighing of words, the repetition of formulas. Everything was a recitation. Because truth was not discovered, it was remembered. And remembering required repetition. That's what the day was. A ritual of repetition. Not because they lacked imagination, but because repetition preserved the pattern. The pattern kept Ma'at. Ma'at kept life. And life in Egypt was never casual, it was a result. By midday, the pharaoh would retreat, not to rest, but to review. Scribes reading scrolls, reports from provinces, offerings accounted, grain measured, flood levels recorded, even bureaucracy was sacred. Because the balance of the state mirrored the balance of the soul, and disorder in one meant disorder in the other. The afternoon brought more rituals, sometimes processions, sometimes festivals. Sometimes the pharaoh would appear in public, riding a chariot, surrounded by guards, casting the tokens of secured grain and gold into the crowd. Not generosity, but liturgy. A performance of divine provision. The people didn't cheer for a man, they cheered for order, for the idea that the sky still worked, that Ra would rise again, and that the king was still the hinge that made it so. By evening, the rites reversed, the gods put to sleep, the statues rewrapped, the incense extinguished, and the pharaoh returned to his quarters, not to feast, not always, but to reflect, to consult with his priests, to dream, to rehearse the underworld. Because sleep, to the Egyptians, was a kind of practice death, and even rest had to be structured. The pharaoh's bed was symbolic, his dreams were watched, everything had meaning. There was no moment where the liturgy ended. He was king in sleep, he was king in silence, because if the world paused for even a second, if Ma'at stuttered, chaos would flood in. And so the king slept as he lived, not for pleasure, but for pattern. And somewhere in the palace, A scribe dipped a reed in ink and wrote down what had been done, because the next day it had to be repeated, exactly, to keep the cycle turning, to keep the stars aligned, to keep the soul of the world intact. So the next time you think of the pharaoh not as a tyrant or a tyrant in gold, but as a weary priest in a golden mask, repeating motions so old they held the sun in place, remember this: he didn't rule by sword, he ruled by schedule, and the true cost of divinity was never power, it was repetition. Let's return to the tomb. Not to the stone this time, but to the people buried inside it, because behind every god-king, behind every golden mask, there was a swarm, a structure, a pyramid of people. The pharaoh did not prepare for eternity alone. He did not enter the afterlife solo, he was followed. By scribes and singers, by generals, by concubines, by artisans who carved his cartouche, by bakers who kneaded the bread, by dwarfs and dancers and wig makers, by priests who whispered the rites. Egypt was not just a monarchy, it was a ritual machine. And every cog had a name. The most powerful below the king was the chatti, the vizier, the one who managed the court, the bureaucracy, the grain, the construction schedules, the tomb blueprints, the legal decisions, the writing, the measuring, the taxation, a prime minister, a chief architect, a high judge all in one. Below him, a web. Priests divided by temple, by god, by role. Some sang, some sacrificed, some cared for sacred animals. Others maintained the statues, some were scribes, some were mortuary specialists. Each temple was an engine, each priest a gear. Then came the artisans, the workers of Deir el-Medina, the secret village near the Valley of the Kings whose sole job was to carve the afterlife. They worked in crews, they had weekends, they drank beer, and they painted the Book of the Dead in flawless symmetry on the walls of royal tombs while raising families and burying their own. Then came the embalmers, the surgeons of spirit, who removed the organs, sealed the jars, perfumed the skin. They were not simply morticians, they were engineers of resurrection. But further still, an entire class of people existed just to serve the dead. They were called Ushabti. Sometimes living, often symbolic, figurines placed in the tomb by the hundreds, little carved bodies holding hoes, wearing baskets, standing at the ready. Their purpose? To do the pharaoh's work in the afterlife. Because paradise in Egypt still had chores, fields to till, water to carry, and the dead were expected to contribute. So these servants, these Ushabti, were the eternal staff, activated by spell, ready to take commands. The elite had hundreds, pharaohs, thousands, but some weren't symbolic at all, some were real. In the earliest dynasties, first, second, human sacrifice was part of royal burial. Servants, guards, attendants interred alongside the king, some buried in chambers, some in rings around the tomb, some curled beside the main sarcophagus like pets. They were not executed violently, they were strangled, drugged. They were told most likely they were being honoured, that they would follow the king into the next world, be rewarded, be remembered. The practice faded by the end of the Old Kingdom, replaced by symbolism, figurines, spells. But for a time it was normal to die with your ruler, to be selected, to be silenced, to be stacked in the dark in case the king needed you on the other side. And not just humans, cats, dogs, crocodiles, ibis, baboons, mummified, wrapped, painted, placed in tombs as offerings or avatars or companions. A menagerie of devotion. Some animals were sacred on their own. The Apis bull, the mummified ram of Amun, the crocodile of Sobek, worshipped, pampered, buried in sarcophagi more luxurious than those of most humans. But many were merely attached, buried because the pharaoh liked them. Because no king walks alone, and while some were symbols, others were staff. The hairdressers who arranged the royal wigs, the brewers who prepared the sacred beer, the perfumers who mixed the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, the sandals were stitched by hand, the papyri copied by moonlight, every name, every lineage, every line. And when the pharaoh died, their jobs didn't end, they followed, sometimes in name, sometimes in wax, sometimes in flesh, and that's what makes it a death state. Not just that the king ruled in life, but that death was an institution, a production, a system that had to be staffed, because eternity was not an idea, it was an operation. You needed priests to read the spells, embalmers to wrap the corpse, artists to paint the underworld, carpenters to build the coffins, scribes to document the rites, singers to calm the gods. Even the mourners had choreography. Professional women, chantresses of Isis, who wept at the tomb in ritual display. Their wails were performance, their tears part of the script. Because the grief had to be witnessed, even the breakdown of order had order. There were guards too, not just for the tomb, but for the scrolls and for the spells and for the integrity of the ritual. A priest could lose his hand for mispronouncing a word. A scribe could be exiled for copying a spell incorrectly. The afterlife had compliance, and every mistake was a risk to the king, to Matt, to the future. So they didn't leave it to chance. They created roles, job titles, protocols, a bureaucracy of eternity. The tomb became a site of labour, from the foreman who tracked stone blocks to the water carriers in the quarry, to the supervisors of linen, to the keepers of pigment, to the high priest of Osiris, to the temple scribes calculating lunar alignments, to the men who measured the distance between stars and walls. Every hand touched the soul, and no one worked alone, because the afterlife had a deadline. Once the king died, the clock started. Tomb completion, sarcophagus ready, mummification on schedule. The opening of the mouth ritual had to be timed. The burial aligned to lunar calendars, the stars in the right place. No room for delay, no second chance. The gods expected precision, so hundreds worked in concert, some for weeks, some for years. And once he was buried, still more work. The mortuary temples, the offering priests, their job to continue the rites, to feed the statues, to burn the incense, to recite the names, because memory was life. And if no one spoke your name, you died again. So they kept speaking, and in the king's name they built, and in his name they harvested, and in his name they lived, and generation by generation the machine kept running until it didn't, until tombs were robbed, temples abandoned, names forgotten, and the bureaucracy of resurrection collapsed. But in its time it worked. It launched kings into stars, it buried worlds inside mountains, it carved books of the dead in corridors you needed ladders to read. It stacked lives on top of lives to make sure one man became a god. That's what you're looking at when you see a mummy in a museum, not a corpse, but a civilization's most elaborate project. The end result of centuries of labour, of prayers, of pigments and lungs and spells and ink. And all around him, if we could see the truth, are the invisible bodies of everyone else who made it possible. Some painted, some wept, some were buried alive. Because no one rises alone, not even a king, especially not a god. Let's open another chamber. This one is darker, not with dust or shadow, but with politics. Because behind every god-king's ascent to eternity, there's another story running underneath it. Not in gold, but in blood. Not about the tomb, but about who gets the tomb, and it begins, as always, with a death. The pharaoh is dead, and the machinery of resurrection is already in motion. Priests chant, linen is measured, coffins prepared, walls inked with spells, but somewhere down a long hallway of the palace a door closes softly, and the whispering begins, because the throne must be filled, quickly, or the world will start to unravel. That's the risk of the divine monarchy. If the king is the hinge of the cosmos, you can't leave the door open long. Someone must become Horus. But succession in ancient Egypt was never simple. There were no primogeniture laws, no unbroken line of firstborn sons, no fixed succession model at all. What you had was precedent, tradition, royal blood. And whoever had the power to enforce them. And so every pharaoh's death was a moment of danger. Because whoever stepped into the throne wasn't just gaining power, they were taking on divinity, and someone, always, disagreed. The first rule of royal continuity? Marry your sister. Not for romance, not for love, but for purity, to keep the divine blood contained. The gods had married their siblings, so the kings must too, and so pharaohs routinely married their sisters, sometimes their daughters. The result? A tightly coiled family tree, genetically fragile. politically explosive? Because multiple wives meant multiple sons meant multiple claims, and claims in a theocracy meant war. But not always with swords, sometimes with dreams, with forged oracles, with altered inscriptions. Sometimes the heir would rewrite history to prove his divine right. Claim a vision from Amun, commission a stela, erase a rival's name from the temple wall. History was not only written by the victors, it was sculpted. Let's meet a few. Thutmose III, the great general pharaoh, Napoleon of the Nile. He wasn't supposed to rule. His stepmother Hatshepsut took the throne as regent and then kept it. For over 20 years. She wore the false beard, took the titles, built the monuments, called herself king. When she died, Thutmose retook the throne and he erased her. Scraped her name from walls, chiselled her face off statues, tried to unwrite her entirely, but history is stubborn, and the stones remembered. Then there's Akhenaten, the heretic. He didn't just change the succession, he changed the universe, abandoned Amun, worshipped Aten the sun disk, closed temples, moved the capital, changed his name, changed his wife's titles, declared that only he could access the divine. He ruled with Nefertiti, a queen so powerful she may have ruled alone after his death. And then came a boy, Tutankhamun, barely a teenager, whose brief reign was really the reign of his advisors, who returned Egypt to its old gods, and whose death young, frail, infected, triggered panic, because there was no son, no heir, and the court scrambled. One letter survives from his widow written to the Hittite king, begging for one of his sons to come marry her. "I will not take a servant," she writes. "I am afraid." The Hittite prince never made it. He was murdered en route, and Tutankhamun's throne passed not to his blood, but to his general, Horemheb, a military man who erased the heresy and declared himself the restorer of order. But there had been no clean handoff, only panic, only whispers, only tombs hastily repainted, because the pharaoh had died too soon and the chain had broken. So what did they fear exactly? Why did it matter so much that the next king take the throne immediately, perfectly, cleanly? Because continuity wasn't political, it was cosmological. The moment one king died, another had to rise to complete the cycle, to become Horus, to keep the heavens spinning. Even the coronation wasn't just ceremony, it was a reenactment of creation. The king stood in ritual poses, recited ancient lines, received crowns, crook and flail, stepped onto sacred ground. He wasn't inheriting power. He was becoming a principle, and the principle couldn't falter. That's why the great royal wife mattered. Not the harem, not the other wives, just her. She was the vessel, the symbolic mother of the nation. Her blood secured the line. Even if the child wasn't hers, her status validated it. Sometimes she ruled, sometimes she brokered, sometimes she poisoned because succession was sacred, and sacred things attract danger. And yes, there were assassinations. There were harem conspiracies. There were princes who vanished. There were tombs that never held the body they were built for. And at the centre of it all, the throne. A seat that was more than furniture. It was balance. It was alignment. If the wrong person sat there, everything could unravel. So they kept it in the family, until the family collapsed. And then they lied, wrote new genealogies, invented divine dreams, because Egypt needed a king, any king, to hold the heavens open. Even if he had no bloodline, even if he wore someone else's crown, even if his name had to be carved over another, because nothing was more dangerous than a throne left empty. And so the succession game played on, not just in life, but in death, because pharaohs planned their tombs the moment they took power, and if that power was stolen or rushed or illegitimate, the tomb might remain unfinished, or worse, be usurped, repainted, recarved, reassigned. There are tombs in the Valley of the Kings that changed owners mid-construction, corridors extended, walls reinscribed, names plastered over. Even the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, it's small, cramped, likely not meant for him, but time ran out, and the priests made do. Because the king had to be buried, he had to become Osiris, or the next king couldn't become Horus, and the sky couldn't rise, and the Nile couldn't flood, and the world as they knew it would dissolve. So tonight, remember this. Behind the stillness of the sarcophagus there was always movement. Deals, bloodlines, secrets, and the silent terror of a crown that couldn't wait. Let's light one last torch in the tomb, not to illuminate the past, but to reveal the ones who cracked it. Because for all the order Egypt worshipped, for all the ma'at they etched into stone, measured in fields, embedded into every linen wrap and lunar calendar, some pharaohs didn't follow the rules, some rewrote them. And when they did, the cosmos flinched. Let's begin with her. Not a wife, not a regent, a king. Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, wife to her half-brother Thutmose II. But when he died young, she became regent for her stepson, Thutmose III. Only she didn't step aside, she stepped up and claimed the throne. Not as queen, but as king. She took the fivefold titulary, wore the false beard, commissioned statues with a male torso, insisted on masculine pronouns in official inscriptions, and ruled for over 20 years, successfully. Peacefully, brilliantly, she built, traded, and expanded temples, led expeditions to Punt. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is a masterpiece. Terraced, symmetrical, carved into the cliffs like a statement. I was here, I ruled, I mattered. But she broke the script, and for that she would pay. Years after her death, her name was chiselled off monuments, her statues shattered, her memory targeted for deletion, likely by Thutmose III, not just in vengeance, but in correction. 'Cause her reign disrupted the pattern, and Egypt, like a temple clock, needed realignment. But the disruption didn't stick. Her name survived, not through lineage, but through limestone, carved too deeply to be erased. Then came him, Akhenaten, the monotheist, son of Amenhotep III, husband to Nefertiti, father perhaps of Tutankhamun, a king who saw the sun and saw only it. Aten, the solar disk. Not a god with form or myth or face, but pure light. He shut the temples, moved the capital to Akhetaten, ordered a new style of art fluid, intimate, exaggerated, images of himself with Nefertiti, kissing daughters, lounging beneath the rays of Aten, each ray ending in a hand, offering life. No crook and flail, no Osiris, no Anubis. He erased the old gods. Even Amun, the great state deity, was scrubbed from inscriptions. This wasn't reform, it was revolution. The religious infrastructure of the kingdom shattered, the priests disempowered, the temples abandoned, the afterlife uncertain, because if there was only one God, and that God had no myth, no gate, no judgment, what then? No weighing of the heart, no Osirian rebirth, no spells to navigate the duat, only light, only Aten, his tomb unfinished, his successors uncertain, his legacy erased. After his death, the capital was abandoned, the temples reactivated, the gods restored. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. The name of Akhenaten was stricken from the king lists, his city swallowed by sand, his statues shattered. But the disruption lingered, because once a god falls, something always breaks in the people, and yet he wasn't the only one. There was also Nefertiti. She may have ruled as pharaoh in her own right, under the name Nefer-Nefer-Ruaten. There was Smenkhkare, a shadowy figure, male or female, maybe a co-regent, maybe a placeholder, and of course there was Tutankhamun, the boy who inherited a kingdom mid-collapse, whose reign was mostly managed by A and Horemheb, who died young, deformed, malarial, buried in haste, whose golden tomb was not a symbol of triumph but of emergency, a death too early, a reign too short, disruption barely healed, and after him, Horemheb, general, commoner, restorer. He erased the entire heretic line, declared himself chosen, and the pattern resumed. But it was never quite the same, because every disruption, every Hatshepsut, every Akhenaten left a ripple, a crack in the crown, a question in the stone. What if the order isn't eternal? What if a woman can be king? What if the sun needs no temple? What if the soul doesn't follow the script? Egypt, of course, rejected those questions, restored the gods, repaired the tombs, repainted the names. But the questions didn't vanish, they simply sank, like unfinished corridors beneath the valley, waiting. then came him. Akhenaten, the monotheist, son of Amenhotep III, husband to Nefertiti, father perhaps of Tutankhamun, a king who saw the sun and saw only it. Etten, the solar disk, not a god with form or myth or face, but pure light. He shut the temples, moved the capital to Akhenaten, ordered a new style of art fluid, intimate, exaggerated, images of himself with Nefertiti kissing daughters, lounging beneath the rays of Aten, each ray ending in a hand offering life. No crook and flail, no Osiris, no Anubis, he erased the old gods. Even Amont, he great state deity, was scrubbed from inscriptions. This wasn't reform, it was revolution. The religious infrastructure of the kingdom shattered, the priests disempowered, the temples abandoned, the afterlife uncertain, 'cause if there was only one God, and that God had no myth, no gate, no judgment, what then? No weighing of the heart, no Osirian rebirth, no spells to navigate the duat. Only light, only Aten. His tomb unfinished, his successors uncertain, his legacy erased. After his death, the capital was abandoned, the temples reactivated, the gods restored. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. The name of Akhenaten was stricken from the king lists, his statues shattered, but the disruption lingered, because once a god falls, something always breaks in the people. And yet he wasn't the only one. There was also Nefertiti, who may have ruled as pharaoh in her own right under the name Neferuaten. There was Smenkhkare, a shadowy figure, male or female, maybe a co-regent, maybe a placeholder. And of course there was Tutankhamun, the boy who inherited a kingdom mid-collapse, whose reign was mostly managed by A and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, who died young, deformed, malarial, buried in haste, whose golden tomb was not a symbol of triumph but of emergency. Death too early, a reign too short, a disruption barely healed. And after him, 𝐓𝐈𝐿, general, commoner, restorer. He erased the entire heretic line, declared himself chosen, and the pattern resumed. But it was never quite the same, because every disruption, every Hatshepsut, every Akhenaten left a ripple, a crack into the crown, a question in the stone. What if the order isn't eternal? What if a woman can be king? Wait, if the sun needs no temple? What if the soul doesn't follow the script? Egypt, of course, rejected those questions, restored the gods, repaired the tombs, repainted the names, but the questions didn't vanish. They simply sank, like unfinished corridors beneath the valley, waiting. So tonight, remember this. Even the most stable mythology is tested by the ones who refuse to follow it, and sometimes those are the ones we remember best. But before the tomb could close, before the mummy could rise, one figure stood between the world of the living and the passage to the duat. Anubis, the jackal-headed god who watched over embalmers, tombs and transitions. He was not the god of the dead in general that role belonged to Osiris, but he was the one who guided the process. The gatekeeper, the preparer, the surgeon priest who ensured the soul's journey was properly launched. Anubis was one of the most ancient deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Worship of him predates Osiris in many locations. He was originally the chief god of the dead, long before Osiris's myth rose to prominence. His name in Egyptian was Inpu, sometimes translated as to decay or royal child. He was associated with cemeteries, embalming tools, and the west, the direction of the setting sun, and the symbolic home of the dead. His animal form, part jackal, part man, was not arbitrary. Jackals were scavengers who prowled burial grounds. Their howls echoed across the desert at dusk, and so the Egyptians did not fear them, they invoked them. They believed that by placing jackal statues at tomb entrances, the real animals would be repelled. By worshipping Anubis, they protected the dead from desecration. He became guardian and protector not of life, but of dignity. In every major funerary text, coffin, texts, pyramid texts, Book of the Dead, Anubis appears. He is the one who performs the opening of the mouth ritual, touching the mummy's lips with sacred tools so the soul could speak, breathe, and remember. He leads the deceased by the hand to the hall of Meiti. He weighs the heart. He adjusts the scales, not as judge, but as functionary. In art he is calm, composed, almost clinical, rarely wrathful. He is shown embalming Osiris himself, kneeling beside the green-skinned god, wrapping his limbs, applying oils, turning death into divinity. That was Anubis's role, to translate biology into eternity. Priests who oversaw mummification often wore jackal masks in his honour. They worked in silence, in teams. The embalming process was not just technical, it was spiritual theatre, and Anubis was the director. Even tomb robbers feared him. Spells invoking Anubis appear on tomb doors and sarcophagi, warning that those who defile the dead will have their hearts devoured, their names erased, their souls lost in the darkness without end. No pyramid curse was complete without a nod to the Jackal Lord. His worship remained strong for centuries. Even during the Hellenistic period, the Greeks identified him with Hermes, calling him Hermanubis, a fusion of psychopomp figures. They saw in him a guide between worlds, a sacred messenger, a liminal being who neither lived nor died, but served the boundary. Anubis never ruled the heavens. He didn't sit on a throne. He wasn't the giver of light or fertility. He didn't demand sacrifice. He didn't meddle in war. He was quiet, precise, necessary. And that's why the Egyptians trusted him. Because when the final rites were spoken, and the bandages sealed, and the heart weighed, and the soul prepared to cross it, was Anubis who stood in the doorway and opened it for you, dragged across desert, floated down river, hauled up sacred causeways polished with the dust of prayers and sweat. Some blocks weighed more than 70 tons, carved from quarries hundreds of miles away, floated on barges that defied modern engineering logic, and pulled by teams of men tethered not by chains but by ceremony. The construction of a royal tomb wasn't a project. It was a national endeavour, a metaphysical mandate, a generational pact between the living and the divine. And once the body was in the ground, the real work began, because the tomb wasn't finished when the pharaoh died. It had only just become functional. A tomb wasn't a burial site. It was a machine, a ritual engine, and it had to be fed. Daily offerings, daily rites, daily invocations, bread and beer, beef and figs, incense, honey, linen, perfumed oils and liturgies whispered in the dark. All of it brought not to honour memory, but to maintain presence, to activate the afterlife, to keep the soul fed, stable and oriented on its eternal journey. That meant land, that meant labour, that meant an economy. Temples, especially mortuary temples attached to the king's tomb, became some of the largest landowners in all of Egypt. They were not just religious institutions, they were economic hubs, granary centres, storage facilities, employers, and engines of redistribution. They managed estates, rented livestock, paid workers, and logged every bushel of barley and spool of linen with administrative precision. Entire towns like Deir el-Medina existed to support the tomb builders, populated by expert craftsmen, overseers, scribes, cooks, and families who passed their professions down like sacred heirlooms. Inscriptions in their homes show they were literate, educated, and proud. They sang hymns to Hathor and carved curses to protect their work from looters. They were paid in kind, mostly food and beer, but also in status, because to build a tomb was to enter eternity by proxy. To carve the walls of the king's afterlife was to stitch yourself into its seams. Many workers scrawled their names or drew cartoons in the margins of tomb corridors. Pashadu was here. Senet Jem painted this. These weren't acts of defiance, they were sacred signatures. They were declarations of participation in something bigger than the Nile, bigger than the palace, bigger than the bloodline. The economy of the dead was circular. The living fed the temples fed the gods ensured the Nile would flood, the flood fed the crops fed the people, and the people in turn sustained the pharaoh's soul through tax, time, tithe and trust. Taxes weren't just for defence or civic planning. They were a form of metaphysical insurance. Give your share to the temple and the balance of the universe stayed intact. Refuse and you risk drought, disease, or disfavour from the gods. Even the scribes who collected tax grain knew they were doing more than accounting. They were weighing cosmic reciprocity, and they took it seriously. Records show detailed grain counts, land plots, offerings tallied to the day, even punishments for shortfalls. But they also record pardons, acts of mercy, adjustments made in the name of fairness, because Ma'at, the principle of balance, governed economic economics too. There were entire hierarchies built to serve the dead: high priests of Amun, overseers of the fields, administrators of temple kitchens, feather makers, coffin painters, basket weavers who specialized in canopic jar containers, potters who shaped miniature food trays for symbolic meals, goldsmiths who inlaid amulets with lapis and turquoise, artisans who knew how to render the jed pillar, the ujat eye, the scarab all in correct orientation and proportion, not for aesthetic but to ensure function. Because an amulet too large might confuse the gods, a glyph drawn backwards might trap the soul in limbo. Precision wasn't style, it was survival. Every object interred in the tomb had to serve a purpose. There were model boats for travel, wooden servants called shabtis to work in the afterlife fields, furniture, games, cosmetics, all included not as comfort items but as continuity devices. The soul must not forget how to be alive. Even in death it must be surrounded by the familiar, the necessary, the symbolic scaffolding of a life well rehearsed. And all of it required a supply chain. Linen from flax fields in the delta, ink from soot and gum, stones hauled from Aswan, cedar wood imported from Lebanon, bitumen for mummification, possibly from the Dead Sea. The death of a pharaoh activated a massive interregional system of procurement and distribution, not because of spectacle, but because of function. Every item served a ritual logic, and every person who contributed, from quarryman to porter to priest, was a cog in the divine machinery. They weren't slaves. Contrary to popular myth, most tomb builders were paid labourers, housed and fed and organised into teams with names like the Friends of the West or the Drunkards of the Tomb. These were not joyless jobs. They came with pride, ritual privilege, and an understanding that what they built would outlast their grandchildren. The idea of divine kingship also reinforced participation. The pharaoh wasn't just a mortal man with wealth. He was the anchor of the cosmos. His health affected the world. His afterlife was the key to continuity. If he reached the stars, so would you. If he failed, so might the harvest. So you helped build his pyramid not just because he commanded it, but because it was metaphysical necessity. This was your job as an Egyptian, to participate in the sacred maintenance of the cycle. The sun must rise, the river must flood, the pharaoh must ascend, and your labour helped keep the pattern intact. Even the act of mourning was systematized. Professional mourners, usually women, were hired to weep at funerals, enacting the grief of Isis and Nephthys for Osiris. Their performance wasn't sentimental, it was structural. They wailed in prescribed rhythms. They sang hymns that opened the way. They wore blue, black or white, because grief, like grain, had to be offered with care. So when we look at these colossal tombs, at these staggering inventories of grave goods, at the miles of painted corridors and rows of ritual coffins, what we're seeing isn't ego. We're seeing investment, not in one man's comfort, but in the cosmos's stability. Death was expensive, but it was worth it. Because if it worked, the world kept spinning. If it failed, everything dissolved into Isfet, into chaos, into the void before creation. And so the economy moved toward the tomb willingly, not just because of belief, but because it worked. Egypt lasted 3,000 years, not by accident, but by systemic ritual, by statecraft woven into theology, by a tax code that fed the sacred, and by generations of workers who believed that chiseling eternity into stone was the most important thing they could do with their lives. They were right, because we are still reading it, still marvelling at it, still feeling the resonance of their invisible hands, and still whispering the names of kings who haven't breathed before 4,000 years. That is the return on investment. That is who paid for forever. And that is why the tomb still glows with the soft gold of belief, labour, and light. Even now, even here, even in your imagination. The priests were not saints, the tombs were not secure, and the afterlife was not free. Even in death there were loopholes, shortcuts, and people who knew how to game the system. Corruption in the funerary economy is not a modern revisionist theory. It is written into the very scrolls and confessions that survive. Priests who pocketed offerings, guards who looked the other way, royal embalmers who took gold from nobles to use a more sacred oil. Death was business, and like all business, it had margins, incentives, backdoors. The tombs of nobles were sometimes fakes, decoys built to fool the greedy. Some real tombs were built, then robbed by the same men who buried the dead. We know this because the workers sometimes left notes or confessed under interrogation. Entire tomb inventories from the 20th dynasty record missing Shabtis, broken seals, stripped gold leaf, not from outside raids, from the inside. When the economy dipped, or the Nile failed to flood, people grew desperate. And the dead had gold. Statues were melted down, amulets stripped, coffins recycled. Even the royal dead were not safe. The tomb of Ramesses VI was reused. The mummy of Ramesses II was found in a cache with others, moved in secret by priests to avoid desecration. There were also fake spells, papyrus sold on the black market that claimed to guarantee a smoother passage through the Duat. One version of the Book of the Dead might have 20 spells, another, for the rich, might have over 100. Spells for protection, spells to breathe, spells to transform, spells to argue with the gods. Some were custom-ordered. Written by professional scribes, paid per spell. This wasn't superstition, it was spiritual arms dealing. Your chances in the afterlife improved with better gear. The cost of a proper burial was immense. Linen, resin, perfume, scribes, canopic jars, amulets, priests, musicians, mourners, furniture. Food. The poorest had pits, the wealthy had workshops, but even the middle class aspired to copy the kings. They mimicked the texts, scaled down the tombs, bargained with embalmers. Some got creative. They paid for one mummification but reused coffins. They bribed guards to sneak into sacred necropolises. They hired out ritual lamenters by the hour. The industry adapted. Supply met demand. Temples were involved too. High priests controlled access to sacred rituals. They could delay a burial. They could alter a name. They could proclaim a mummy impure, and for the right price they could fix it. We have letters between officials warning of theft, forgery, bribery. We have records of trials where temple workers were caught selling tomb contents. One priest even used burial funds to build his own house. The boundary between devotion and profit was porous. And yet, through it all, belief endured. People still paid, still prayed, still built tombs they couldn't afford because the hope of eternity was stronger than the risk of fraud. And many priests were honest. Many embalmers took pride in their craft. Many scribes copied spells with reverence. But the system had cracks, and the dead, for all their magic, could not complain. Some tombs were designed with false doors and fake corridors, not for decoration, to trick looters, to buy time. Some families used curses, not metaphorical ones. Literal threats carved into stone. May your children die in pain, may your name be erased, may your soul wander blind. It was legal, spiritual, psychological warfare. And sometimes it worked. By the late period, the entire death economy had become a labyrinth of competition and showmanship. Coffins grew more ornate, faces more stylized, spells more elaborate. Priests offered deluxe packages. Burial clubs emerged. You could pay into a collective fund, like insurance, to ensure your afterlife was properly staffed. Even the poorest aspired to mayat. Even the lowest caste hoped for the field of reeds. So they paid what they could, and they hoped the gods didn't check the receipts. We look at Egypt and see stone, permanence, stability. But beneath that stone was a living network of trade, faith, and corruption. A system held together not by purity but persistence. The pharaohs built eternity, but others sold it. And some counterfeited it. And all of them, honest or not, helped keep the afterlife running. Because even gods need administrators. And even the dead need accountants. And in Egypt, death was never the end. It was a transaction, a procession, a performance, and sometimes a con, but always it was paid for. The pharaoh was divine. That was the story. And like all powerful stories, it needed a body. A living vessel that could carry godhood on its skin, walk divinity through the halls of power, and wear immortality in its bones. But the truth, the real truth, came later, when the wrappings came off, when the CT scans were made, when the DNA was sequenced. And what we found was not a god, but a human, often as sick, sometimes deformed, always mortal. Take Tutankhamun, the boy king, the golden mask, the global icon. Beneath the mask was a teenager with a cleft palate, a clubfoot, curved spine, and necrosis in his left foot. He walked with a cane. Dozens of them were found in his tomb. His DNA showed traces of inbreeding, the likely result of a royal lineage obsessed with purity but blind to its consequences. He also had malaria, possibly several infections. His left leg was broken badly. Some say it was the cause of death. Others say it happened during embalming. But the image remains, a fragile, limping boy buried beneath an avalanche of gold. And he was not alone, Ramesses. The second, the great builder, had severe arthritis, his spine curved with age, his arteries hardened, he had dental abscesses and a crooked nose. Seti I had a pronounced overbite and signs of arteriosclerosis. Amenhotep III suffered from obesity and dental problems. One mummy, possibly Ramesses III, shows evidence of violent death. His throat was cut, his toes severed. A harem conspiracy turned divine monarchy into murder mystery. Royal mummies have shown signs of scarring, trauma, parasites and chronic infections. Their bodies preserved in linen and resin, yes, but marked by the same decay that touches all humans. Mummification preserved them, but it also exposed them. The chemicals used, the techniques employed, the organs removed or left behind all reveal medical knowledge, ritual priorities and human error. Some mummies were well preserved, their faces serene, their skin intact. Others were hastily embalmed, scorched by resins, mispacked, miswrapped. One had a stick shoved down his throat to keep his mouth open in a death smile. Some were buried with amulets over the heart, others without. The variations tell us that even in god-making there were different grades, different craftsmen, different intentions. The physical body of a pharaoh was not just symbolic, it was cosmic technology. The eyes painted on the sarcophagus allowed the dead to see. The heart, ideally left in place, was weighed in the afterlife. The brain, considered useless, was removed through the nose and discarded. The skin was coated in natron, the body drained of moisture. Linen was wrapped layer by layer, each piece inscribed or anointed. The process took 70 days. 70 days to turn a corpse into a conduit. And yet, for all the precision, all the ritual, the body still decayed. And science, centuries later, found its truth. CT scans revealed cranial damage, dental X-rays showed abscesses, radiocarbon dating corrected assumed chronologies, DNA testing unraveled family trees and exposed generational collapse. The royal family was not just divine, it was genetically entangled. Siblings marrying siblings, cousins pairing with cousins. The desire to preserve the bloodline led to congenital defects, weakened immunity, and physical deformities. Divine inheritance became a biological curse, and the body, meant to be perfect, bore the burden. But these were not just accidents of breeding. They were choices made in the name of power. The pharaoh's body had to be unique, set apart, sacred. The deformities may have been hidden in life but embalmed in gold in death, because the illusion mattered, the rituals mattered, the image of perfection was sculpted in stone, even as the bones told a different story. Modern archaeology has approached these mummies with reverence and scalpels. Each incision reveals something new: amulets sewn between wrappings, hidden scrolls, scented resins from far-off lands, linen dyed with rare pigments. Some even had prosthetics, wooden toes, finger covers, braces. The dead were dressed for judgment, equipped for eternity. And beneath the layers, the human truth waited patiently. The embalming tools themselves reveal a deep knowledge of anatomy. Bronze knives, resin stirrers, natron containers, canopic jars shaped like sons of Horus to protect lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines. The heart was often removed, sometimes mistakenly, sometimes ceremonially. The absence of the heart in some mummies, like Tutankhamun, has puzzled scholars. Was it damaged, lost, or intentionally excluded? Embalming was not science alone. It was theatre. Every incision was part of a cosmic play. The embalmers wore masks of Anubis. The mourners cried scripted lamentations. The process was sacred, choreographed and exacting, but it was still at its core about preserving flesh. And flesh fails. When the French examined Ramesses II, they had to give him a passport to transport his body. The passport listed his occupation as king deceased. Even in death, bureaucracy endured. But the examination revealed more than forms. It showed his bones were brittle, his teeth worn, his spine arched with age. The divine king was a man who limped into eternity. There is something deeply humbling about the forensic gaze. It cuts through centuries of myth and finds cavities, fractures, blood types. It replaces incense with isotopes. And yet it does not destroy the magic. It deepens it. Because the more we learn about these bodies, the more they speak. And what they say is this: godhood is performance, divinity is costume, but mortality is always real. The body of the king was wrapped in myth, swaddled in ritual painted in gold. But under it all was a rib cage, a spine, a liver that failed, a tooth that ached. And in that aching there is connection, because it means the pharaoh, for all his power, was like us, tired, hurt, breakable, and still they buried him like a star, surrounded by constellations of treasure, enshrined in architecture that echoed eternity. They carved his name into stone, painted his face on walls, sealed his organs in alabaster. They believed he would rise. They needed him to rise, because if he could, maybe they could too. And so the divine body, broken as it was, became a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. The mummy was a mirror, and in that mirror we saw our own wish not to disappear. Not every pharaoh was tall, not every pharaoh was strong, but every pharaoh was preserved, because in preservation was defiance, and in defiance was meaning. The body rots, but the story remains, and that perhaps is the closest thing to godhood any human ever achieves. He was barely a man when he died, just 18 or 19, and yet today he's the most famous pharaoh in the world, not because of what he built, not because of how he ruled, but because no one managed to rob him. Tutankhamun, the boy king, the forgotten monarch, who became immortal not through power, but through preservation. His tomb was small, hastily prepared. His death was unexpected and his burial rushed. Yet that very haste may have saved it. Nestled in the Valley of the Kings, obscured by debris from later tombs, his resting place went undisturbed for over 3,000 years. And when Howard Carter uncovered the first step, the world went mad. The door was sealed, the corridor untouched, and when Carter held a candle to the darkness and peered in, he saw what generations had only imagined. Gold, everywhere, gilded beds, thrones, chariots, statues, and at the heart of it all, a nested series of shrines and coffins, 3 sarcophagi, one inside the other, and inside the final coffin a mask, gold and lapis, inlaid eyes and royal regalia, a face sculpted for forever. The mask became the face of ancient Egypt itself, and the boy behind it, once a minor ruler, became legend. But Tutankhamun's tomb tells us more than just a tale of untouched treasure. It reveals what death meant. The rooms were packed to bursting with ritual goods, oils, food, linens, games, weapons, model boats, jewellery, amulets. Nothing was random. Every object had symbolic purpose. The king's sandals shaped for the afterlife to do it. The dagger, forged from meteoric iron, connecting him to the heavens. The golden shrines, layered like protective shells. And yet, despite the wealth, signs of disorder, scratched walls, haphazard arrangements, rushed paintings, a burial done in grief and panic, a boy not meant to die so soon. Tut's early death left questions. Some believed he was murdered, others pointed to his deformities and disease. Modern analysis suggests he was frail, inbred, riddled with illness, his left foot necrotic, his body damaged, possibly during embalming, his heart mysteriously absent, his tomb smaller than expected. But the magic was intact, the burial sealed, and the myth began to grow. When Carter's team broke the seal, stories of a curse followed. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron, died shortly after the discovery. Others in the expedition suffered illness or tragedy. Newspapers whispered of an ancient vengeance, the curse of the pharaoh. Of course, there's no scientific evidence for any of it. Most involved lived long lives, but the idea stuck, because humans crave stories, and death, especially royal death, begs for magic. The curse gave the tomb an aura, a forbidden glamour, and it helped elevate Tutankhamun from obscurity to superstardom. Western fascination with the boy king exploded. Exhibitions of his treasures drew millions. The golden mask became a symbol of eternal mystery. Scholars probed his mummy. Documentaries speculated endlessly. His image was printed on mugs, t-shirts, postage stamps. The irony was thick. In life, he was a minor figure. In death, he became a brand. And behind the spectacle, the real Tut faded again. A sickly child with a divine title, a puppet in court politics, a ruler who tried to restore the old gods after his father's heresy. That father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had abandoned Egypt's pantheon for the worship of one god, the Aten. Tutankhamun's reign reversed those changes. He brought back Amun, reinstated traditional priesthoods. His name, once Tutankhaten, was changed to honour the old ways, but his reign was brief, and when he died, the dynasty crumbled. Horemheb, a general, took power. Tut's memory was erased from official records, his monuments defaced, his name omitted from king lists. He was buried and forgotten. Until Carter found him, Tutankhamun's posthumous fame reveals the strange dynamics of memory and myth. His intact tomb became the exception that proved the rule. Most royal graves were looted, most treasures lost, most names faded, but Tut endured, not through power, but through accident. His obscurity saved him, his rushed burial kept him hidden, and that fluke gifted the modern world its most vivid glimpse into ancient funerary belief. His burial goods reveal the totality of Egyptian afterlife theology, the Ba and Ka, the journey through the underworld, the spells of protection, the alignment with the stars, the belief that death was not an end but a transformation. Tut's tomb was a chrysalis, a metaphysical engine designed to launch a fragile, broken body into eternity. But it also became a mirror, a reflection of modern obsessions, our need to romanticize the past, to find beauty in decay, to assign meaning to opulence. The golden mask is exquisite, but beneath it was a damaged skull, the shrine immassive, but built for a child who never truly ruled. The treasures inspire awe, but they also demand a question. Why did so much wealth exist for the death of one boy? The answer lies in belief. The pharaoh was not just king, he was a conduit, a guarantee. If he reached the afterlife, so would Egypt. If his journey failed, so might the world, so no expense was spared. Not for the man, but for the symbol. And that symbol, Tutankhamun, lives on, not just in gold, but in curiosity, in obsession, in the human need to touch the eternal. There is no curse in the tomb, only legacy. And beneath the layers of treasure and rumour is a simple haunting truth. A teenager died, a civilization mourned, and the sands buried the story until we were ready to remember it again. There is no eternity without upkeep, no paradise without maintenance. Even the most sacred machine rusts. And when the intricate apparatus of Egyptian death began to fracture, it did not fall in fire and revolution, but in silence, in theft, in neglect. Tomb raiding did not begin in modernity. It was already a problem in the Old Kingdom. The very workers who carved the burial chambers sometimes returned to plunder them. They knew the layouts, they knew the traps, they knew that inside these stone sanctuaries lay unimaginable wealth, not only in gold but in scented oils, linen, fine cosmetics, food offerings, lapis lazuli inlay. These weren't just corpses, they were vaults. Deir el Medina, the workers' village, has revealed graffiti that jokes about theft, ostraca that hint at who took what. Some tombs show signs of intrusion mere years after burial. Seals broken, coffins forced open, mummies dismembered. The cult of the dead required daily offerings, but when those offerings slowed, so did the vigilance. Priests were bribed or absent, temple guards grew complacent, and tomb robbing became not just common but normalized. Even officials were complicit. Investigative papyri from the 20th dynasty describe entire squads of guards being questioned for looting royal graves. Some confessed to cutting gold from coffins and melting it down for bribes or food. The irony was brutal. The divine kings who built whole economies to support their afterlife were dismembered by the same system that once upheld them. Worse still, the priesthood, once guardians of cosmic order, became power brokers. As the New Kingdom declined, religious authority expanded. The high priests of Amun began to rival pharaohs. Temples amassed land, labour, and wealth. Some priests even buried themselves with royal grandeur. When resources tightened, sacrifices had to be made. And often it was the dead who paid. Burial items were recycled, tombs were reused, mummies were relocated, hidden, disguised. The royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, where dozens of pharaohs, including Ramses II, were found rewrapped and repacked in a single tomb, was not an act of reverence. It was triage, a desperate attempt to preserve dignity in a world that no longer cared. Temples crumbled, paint peeled from sacred walls, sand buried holy pathways, and the rituals lost their rigour. Spells from the Book of the Dead were copied hastily, sometimes with errors. Precious pigments were diluted. Statues once treated with oils and incense were left to decay. Even the gods were no longer safe. Akhenaten had shattered the pantheon a century earlier, but now it was neglect that silenced the divine. Shrines to Osiris, Anubis, and Hathor stood empty. Sacred lakes dried. The sole navigation system, once precise as astronomy, buckled. Without proper funerary rites, the bar could not return. The car had no fuel. The heart might not pass the weighing. Eternity wasn't eternal. It required service. When that service ended, the afterlife became a ghost town. In the late period, Greek and Persian influences layered over the old faith. Tombs grew smaller, burial goods more symbolic. Local cults flourished while national coherence faltered. Isis gained popularity abroad while Egypt's own theology fragmented. The soul journey turned bureaucratic. Spells, once sacred, became checklists. The spirit was no longer escorted by gods but processed like a claim. And that shift, subtle and slow, marked the unravelling. For 2,000 years, Egypt had refined a metaphysical blueprint. It mapped death, like a kingdom. But by the third intermediate period, the map was lost. Not erased, but forgotten, piece by piece. Even nature turned against the illusion. The Nile, once predictable, changed its rhythms. Crops failed. Invaders arrived. Nubians, Assyrians, Libyans. The divine order Mahat was harder to maintain. With each disruption, the idea of eternal kingship eroded. The tombs no longer promised salvation. They became liabilities, targets, empty monuments. When Alexander the Great arrived in 322 BCE, he found Egypt hollowed. The old gods still lingered, but their temples echoed. The rituals remained, but without urgency. Death had lost its mystique. It was no longer a door, just a room already looted. And yet in that collapse something honest emerged. For the first time in millennia, death became a shared fate again. No longer a cosmic hierarchy with gold masks and boat-shaped coffins, but a quiet vanishing. The pharaohs had tried to engineer forever, but forever needs funding. It needs faithful hands, and without them, even gods turn to dust. Cleopatra did not die in gold. Her tomb has never been found. No resplendent pyramid, no mortuary temple, no chorus of priests keeping vigil over her sacred corpse. She was not embalmed in the traditional way. She was not laid to rest with canopic jars or funerary texts or spells inked onto linen. She was the last pharaoh, and she died like a mortal. When Cleopatra died in 30 BC, she took with her the last living thread of a lineage that had, for 3,000 years, claimed divine right to rule. Egypt, once the axis of heaven and earth, became a province. Its gods fell stubborn. Its rituals crumbled. Its pharaoh was now a Roman myth. Her reign was a performance of power and a requiem for everything Egypt once was. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, Macedonian Greeks who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest, Cleopatra was a foreigner by blood but an Egyptian by right. She was the first in her line to speak Egyptian fluently. She restored temples, honoured native gods, and styled herself as Isis reborn. In statues and coins she wore traditional regalia, vulture headdress, solar disk, uraeus, and she appeared in temple reliefs, offering sacrifices to Horus, Anubis, and Osiris. But it was a simulacrum. The old religion still moved, but as shadow play. The cults of the dead persisted, but hollowed. The tombs were smaller. The priests served under Roman scrutiny. The rituals were abridged. And in the background, empire pressed in. Cleopatra ruled at a time when Egypt was no longer the master of its fate. Julius Caesar had arrived in Alexandria years before, drawn by dynastic chaos and Roman ambition. Cleopatra seduced him, perhaps politically, perhaps personally, and secured her throne. Together they had a son, but Caesar was murdered in Rome. And when she aligned herself with Mark Antony, another Roman general, the fate of Egypt became entangled in the dying throes of the Roman Republic. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE sealed their doom. Octavian, Caesar's heir, defeated Antony's forces, and when Antony fell on his sword, Cleopatra followed, by snake, by poison, by myth. Her death was not ritualized. It was politicized. There was no embalming ceremony under Anubis's watch. No priests reciting spell 105 from the Book of the Dead. No procession of mourners with shaved heads and oil-drenched linen. Her death was theatrical, a final act to deny her conquerors a public execution, and in doing so she became more myth than monarch. Octavian allowed her a burial but stripped it of pharaonic grandeur. There would be no cult of Cleopatra, no divine rites, no tomb meant to last 10,000 years, just a quiet interment in a world that no longer believed. Cleopatra's suicide did more than end a dynasty. It ended a cosmology. The pharaoh was not simply a king or queen. The pharaoh was the bridge between heaven and earth, Horus in life, Osiris in death, a living node in the circuitry of the cosmos. The rituals surrounding death had not been about mourning, they had been about maintenance, keeping the universe stable, ensuring the Nile would rise, protecting the soul's long journey through the Doat. With Cleopatra's death, that divine machinery shut down. There would be no more pharaohs to carry Ma'at forward. The temples would fade into museums, the gods would become curiosities. Death was no longer a transformation, it was simply an ending. Later Roman writers, especially Plutarch and Dio Cassius, romanticized Cleopatra's death. They cast her as both femme fatale and tragic heroine. But none of them were there, and none of them were Egyptian. The native voices had gone silent. What survived were echoes, burned papyri, temple ruins, a few coins, the faint outlines of cartouches carved into collapsing sandstone. The death cults vanished, and with them the language of immortality. Latin did not know how to say bar or car. It did not understand that to embalm a body was to prepare a soul, to place an amulet was to encode a spell, to anoint a corpse was to activate eternity. Without that grammar, the old sentences died. Cleopatra became a symbol, but not the kind her ancestors would have recognized. She was painted as a siren, a temptress, a political pawn. She was dramatized in Shakespeare, orientalized in 19th century paintings, modernized in Hollywood. But none of those versions show her in the House of Eternity standing before Osiris, her heart weighed against the feather of truth. They do not show her wrapped in linen by priestly hands. They do not show her soul navigating the lakes of fire, or speaking the 72 names of the gods to pass the gates. In that sense, Cleopatra died twice. Once in Alexandria, and once in our imagination. By the 1st century CE, Egypt was a Roman theme park of dead gods. Tourists visited pyramids as curiosities. Scribes copied hymns they no longer believed. The Valley of the Kings was no longer sacred ground, but stone quarries and hiding places. The divine language, hieroglyphs, was forgotten, and with it, the instructions for eternity. Cleopatra's death marked the terminal point of a theological empire, one that had measured time in dynasties, built galaxies from tombs, and embalmed the cosmos in linen and gold. What followed was memory, not belief. And so the last pharaoh, a woman of unmatched intellect, strategy, and symbolic power, left behind no golden shrine, only a silence where the gods used to speak. The ritual was broken, the body unglorified, and the afterlife, once the most elaborately engineered idea on Earth, simply shut its doors. They buried the stars. Or at least they tried. They measured the heavens and traced the constellations into limestone. They aligned tombs with the solstice, carved solar barks into ceilings, and painted the night sky on the lids of sarcophagi. They inked the names of gods onto gold leaf and whispered spells over the bones of kings. They imagined eternity as a map, a journey, a kingdom just on the other side of the sun. And yet none of it lasted. The tombs were cracked, the priests disappeared, the rites forgotten. The language of the gods fell silent for 2,000 years, and the pharaohs, those cosmic monarchs, were reduced to curiosities, mummies in glass cases, exhibits with backlit panels, echoes of a people who once believed that death could be defeated with geometry, linen, and divine bureaucracy. But what if the point was never to win? What if the entire system was less about immortality than about the refusal to go quietly? Imagine you are lying on a slab of alabaster. Your name has been spoken for the last time. The tomb is sealed. Darkness wraps itself around your body like a second skin. The rituals have ended. The offerings stop. The spells fail. And still, you wait. Not because you expect to wake, but because something in your bones remembers the promise of the stars. It is in that waiting, that refusal to vanish, that the pharaohs were most human, and perhaps most divine. You can't bury the cosmos. You can pile rock upon rock. You can inscribe every stone with the face of a god. You can line the walls with sacred geometry, weigh the heart, embalm the flesh, guard the body with jackal-headed sentinels. But eventually time breaks through. The floodwaters rise, the sand eats the doorway, the belief thins. And yet we keep doing it. We keep naming the dead. building monuments, mourning forward. Even now, in a world of algorithms and entropy, we ritualize memory, we digitize the past, we write obituaries, we build statues, we light candles, we eulogize in pixels, because the fear of being forgotten is more terrifying than death itself. The ancient Egyptians simply built a better metaphor. For all their myths, all their gods, all their golden coffins and cosmic maps, the pharaohs still died. Their empires fell, their temples burned, their bodies decayed, however carefully wrapped. But their stories, those still live, in textbooks, in museums, in dreams, and in this moment, right now, with your headphones in, your eyes heavy, your mind wandering through desert corridors and candlelit chambers, they rise again. And maybe that's the point. Maybe immortality isn't a destination. Maybe it's a recurrence, a memory that loops, a name that echoes. So let me ask you, what would you leave behind? If the gates of the underworld were real, if the feather still waited on the scales, if your soul had to speak its name to pass, what spell would you write? What story would you carve into the walls of time, not because you expect to live forever, but because you refuse to be erased? The pharaohs wrote in stone, we write in light, but the hunger is the same, to outlast decay, to be remembered, not as gods, but as humans who tried. And maybe that's all eternity really is, a long hallway of memory, lined with names, etched in love, fear, gold and dust. And maybe, just maybe, you are already walking through it, not as a pharaoh, but as someone who stayed awake long enough to wonder. We used to know how to die. We laid the body in linen, not silence. We sang for the departed. We lit the lamps. We spoke the name aloud until it wore grooves in the stars. Death was not hidden behind curtains or disguised in euphemism. It was an architecture, a rhythm, a public ritual for a private crossing. The pharaohs didn't just face death. They designed it. They rehearsed it. They built entire landscapes around it. They engineered it with the precision of a cosmology, because they understood that death wasn't the enemy. Oblivion was, and the only antidote was memory. But then we forgot. We turned death into data, into diagnosis, into something to be managed, minimized, postponed. We put it in sterile rooms, behind sliding doors. We let machines whisper the last rites. We lost the scripts, the songs, the cosmic choreography. And in doing so, we let fear metastasize. Not just fear of dying, but fear of feeling, of grieving, of looking mortality in the eye and saying, yes, I know I won't last, but I can still make this beautiful. The pharaohs weren't wiser than us, but they were more honest. They didn't pretend death could be defeated. They only demanded it be dignified. They demanded that it be an event, not a failure. And they built their lives around the shape of that ending. Their homes, their art, their government, their stories, all pointed toward the same door. The West, where the sun sets, where the gods wait, where the soul steps onto the bark of night and begins the long sail home. Today, we don't sail. We stall. We distract. We delay. We let death arrive like a power outage, sudden, awkward, unlit. But what if we remembered? What if we let death back in? Not as a horror, but as a hinge. What if we painted our tombs with memory? What if we practiced our goodbyes before they were needed? What if we let our hearts be weighed, not just buried? The Egyptians believed you had to speak the names of the dead to keep them alive, that forgetting was the second death. And maybe that's what we've done. We forgot death. We forgot how to honour it, how to sit with it, how to stare into it without blinking. And in that forgetting, something hollowed out, something sacred, something necessary. But it's not too late. If you're hearing this, if you've come this far through all the corridors and chambers, through linen and oil and prayer and power, then maybe you've already begun to remember. Maybe there is a little gold mask inside you, a small radiant ember that refuses to go out. And maybe that's enough. So let this be your right. Let this be your fire in the dark. You do not have to be a pharaoh. You only have to be awake. And when the time comes, may you walk through the gate not with fear, but with wonder. May you step softly into the sands of forever, leaving behind a name not carved in stone but carried in love, a whisper, a seed, a tiny defiance against the silence. Good night, traveller. Thank you for remembering. The story doesn't end. It only returns. In the mid-19th century, when Carl Richard Lepsius gathered, categorized and published the collection of funerary spells that would become known to the Western world as the Book of the Dead, He was not merely translating a document, he was unsealing a worldview. Before Lepsius, Egyptian tomb inscriptions were often regarded as fragments of liturgy or disjointed rituals. But his systemization of these hundreds of chapters allowed modern eyes to see what ancient Egyptians had always understood, that death was a journey, not a conclusion. And the Book of the Dead was not scripture, it was software, not a dogma, but a toolkit, not a sermon, but a map. In its native title, these texts were called the Chapters of Going Forth by Day. That phrasing alone betrays the optimism embedded in Egyptian metaphysics. Death was not a descent into darkness, but a return to light. It was a daily rebirth, a becoming. The spells were instructions, some poetic, some logistical, meant to equip the soul with passwords, rituals, arguments, and protections. Like travel documents and coded incantations, they offered the dead safe passage through the perils of the underworld. Each spell was a safeguard, a contingency plan, a magical clause in the soul's eternal contract. What the National Geographic article highlights so poignantly is the physicality of this theology. The Book of the Dead was not abstract. It was inked onto papyrus, painted onto tomb walls, inscribed on sarcophagi and amulets. It was woven into the very fabric of burial. Some copies were personal and elaborate, made to order for nobles and royals. Others were mass-produced, left blank in places to insert the deceased's name. These texts were democratized magic. Once reserved only for pharaohs, by the New Kingdom period they were accessible to anyone wealthy enough to commission a copy. The dead needed not just a good heart, but a good budget. The text itself is a patchwork of older funerary literature, the pyramid texts and the coffin texts woven together across dynasties. There was no single authoritative version. Instead, what survived were variations. Texts adapted and rearranged, illustrated or plain, handwritten or imprinted. But despite the textual flux, their purpose was stable. The Book of the Dead was a survival manual for the spirit. The rituals that accompanied its use were sensory and dramatic. During the funeral, a priest would recite key spells at the tomb. The rite of opening the mouth was meant to restore the corpse's ability to eat, speak, and breathe, capacities necessary for the afterlife. This idea of ritual reactivation reveals a culture obsessed not with finality, but with continuity. Even the most basic human needs, food, breath, voice, were treated as sacred technologies. The afterlife imagined in these texts was neither entirely spiritual nor entirely physical. It was somewhere in between. The dead would join Re, the sun god, aboard a boat sailing the underworld. Along the way they would confront chaos embodied by Apep, the serpent of entropy. The text is clear. Death is not rest. It is a nightly battle, a repeating hero's journey through terror and trial. The dead had to pass through gates guarded by fearsome beings, each requiring the correct name and spell. This was an esoteric bureaucracy. The soul needed paperwork, credentials, passwords. And then came the judgment. The Hall of Two Truths, 42 judges, a declaration of innocence against a litany of sins, some moral, some mundane, some peculiar. This confession reads less like law and more like self-editing. I have not made others weep. I have not slayed sacred cattle. I have not hoarded grain. The weighing of the heart, officiated by Anubis, was not just a spectacle, it was an algorithm of justice. The heart, the record of a person's life, had to be light enough to balance the feather of Maat. It was not enough to die. One had to deserve eternity. To fail the judgment was to meet annihilation. Some chapters offer grotesque imagery, a soul eating its own waste or being devoured by beasts. Others threaten endless thirst or perpetual silence. These weren't just fears of the physical, they were existential punishments, the deletion of identity. The Egyptians feared oblivion more than pain. To be unremembered was to be unmade. Yet for the righteous, paradise awaited. The fields of Aru, fertile lands, flowing waters, sweet beer and warm bread. The pleasures of life not denied, but restored. And even in this utopia, the dead had to work to till the soil, reap the barley. But they didn't work alone. Ushabti figures, small statues buried with the deceased, would spring to life through magic and labour in their place. These were not servants in metaphor. They were literal, magical labourers, activated by spells. Even paradise required logistics. The Book of the Dead shows us that ancient Egyptian religion was not static. It evolved, it expanded, it absorbed regional traditions and shifted with dynastic priorities. But its core remained intact, the belief that death was a complex landscape requiring preparation. Not just emotional or ethical readiness, but practical tools. Language was power, name was identity, ritual was engineering. Lepsius did not invent the Book of the Dead, but by compiling and organising it, he made visible the immense narrative it told not of gods alone, but of human longing, a longing to be safe, to be seen, to be remembered, a longing so great it filled scrolls, temples, tombs and hearts with spells, not to escape death, but to survive it. And in reading it now, across the gulfs of time and translation, we are offered something rare, a mirror. Because though the papyrus yellows and the ink fades and the tombs collapse, the need remains. We too ask to be carried. We too want to say, prepare a path for me. We too want our hearts to balance, and if not in a hall of two truths, then in the quiet judgment of the ones we leave behind.